I am, this is Linda. I am just starting recording. So henceforth,
Careful what you say.
That's right. Please be aware of the fact that this will be there for posterity.
All right. Well, I do want to share with people that I'm doing this presentation on a break from session 2 of Camp Grammy and Grandpa. Session 1 was our granddaughter, 11-year-old granddaughter, and her 8-year-old brother from Durham, who spent almost 2 weeks with us. And now we have their cousin, our granddaughter Betty from Minneapolis, who will be here for a week. Roberta and I had to dig deeply into our camp counselor backgrounds, and it's been okay. They've had a great time.
We just can't have grandchildren first. They're so much fun.
Right.
They are.
Right. We have to correct everything that the parents have done wrong in a very short period of time. Now, the first rule of grandparenting is this: zip it up. You know.
Yeah.
So. All right, so we have more people joining.
Yeah, let's wait another minute or two
Sure,
just to let
sure.
everyone in, and then
There was
a few more.
Yeah, there was another program that Bonnie Margolis put out. Dr. Farley was talking on the health disparities based on discrimination. So it was going to last from 6:30 to 8. So there might be some people that I just left the other one to come to this one.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, no, I just heard about it yesterday. It was Dr. Farley talking on the inequities and racial disparity within our healthcare system. And it's too bad because it's very good, also a very good issue.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so that is not supposed to happen, but I guess.
Right.
No, but just in case.
Yeah, okay. All right, so there could be another round coming in at 8 o'clock.
Right.
That's great. Well, I'm going to start an introduction, and that way I get to delay Lester's start. So I just want to say that this is the third series on third part of a series on global crises and global conversations on crises. So we'll see if we can keep going on this. We have to take a break for the high holidays, but we can continue afterwards. So if you have suggestions for people who like to speak and ask questions to and engage in discussions, send the recommendations my way, and we can make it happen. So I also wanted to thank Lester in particular for coming out for this third, for taking charge of this third presentation on global crises. I have this feeling that many of you know Lester better than I do. I had the privilege of meeting Lester just last week. So as you know, Lester is one of the most influential trial lawyers in Wisconsin, focusing on civil rights, our Constitution, and social and criminal justice. I did go back and read some biographies, including this wonderful interview on, I think of your wife on the Isthmus. And I learned that, this is amazing to me. I learned at the age of 26 that you literally burst onto the scene. This was 1976 when you negotiated the release of over a dozen prisoners, I guess, in the Wampum Correctional Institute by going in and talk to the prisoners yourself.
Right.
That was really remarkable. So you've argued, my understanding, you're going to tell us, I guess, about this, arguing in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court and all the challenges to the Walker administration. And then I learned this other really neat thing on this Isthmus article, that you started a program at your law firm called Deep Roots, New Branches. And that's really impressive to lay the groundwork, my understanding is, of the next generation of lawyers defending our civil rights. That was really neat. So Lester's graciously offered to talk about 2 topics, and really, Lester, any topics you want to talk about. This would be the protests in Portland, Oregon, and the recent Wisconsin Supreme Court decision to strike down the Safer at Home rule.
Okay.
So Lester will talk for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then we'll get to ask questions. Linda is our administrator par excellence tonight, so thank you, Linda. And Linda and I will be monitoring the chat box, so you can ask questions by raising your Zoom hand, or since we can see you, just raising your hand at all, and we will keep track and call on you. So Lester, it's all yours. Thank you very much and welcome.
Well, Gil, thank you for inviting me to make this presentation. I'm you know, we're all now used to Zoom, and you know, I'm glad that we can use this format in the circumstances that we're in, so we can share information and so forth, and you know, stay in touch, because one of the things about the pandemic is that you know, it's pretty easy to lose touch with people, and so it's really a pleasure for me to be doing this. And the topic is you know, civil liberties in a time of crisis, and I gave a lot of thought about what's the crisis. That's the first question, and the second question are, what are civil liberties, and do people really know what civil liberties are? So first, I want to talk about what are civil liberties, and why would there be a crisis that involves them at all? Now, civil liberties are not human rights. Civil liberties are guarantees of certain rights that citizens of different countries have. Those are rights that the government guarantees that it will not infringe. Now, we as American citizens think about the Bill of Rights as our rights. What most people don't know, probably because it's not really well taught in schools and in civics class, is that the Bill of Rights, only when it was enacted, only applied to actions of the federal government. That is, there was this new government that was created. And at the time it was created, everyone was worried about, you know, a monarchy being created by this creation of a president who was going to be elected not by a popular vote, but by a college of wise people, the Electoral College, with a Senate that wasn't elected by the people, was elected by state legislatures. And there was a great concern about the government being created that would trample on the rights of the people who had just thrown off the kingdom of Great Britain and the despotic rule of the monarchs there. And so when we think about our civil liberties, we generally think about the liberties that are guaranteed in the United States Constitution. But when it started out, they weren't guaranteed against the actions of our own states. That our civil liberties, the guarantees of liberty, were guaranteed by our state constitutions, not by the United States Constitution. And the state constitutions could be anything. There could have been state religions. We went up to the states. The fundamental thing that happened to change that relationship between the people and the Bill of Rights was the Civil War and the post-Civil War amendment, the 14th Amendment. And it didn't happen overnight. But the 14th Amendment guarantees all citizens the equal protection of the law and the right to due process. And I want to read section 1 of the 14th Amendment to everyone, because it's really, really quite important. Because I'm going to digress for a second after I read it. And it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment, Article 14, Amendment 14, Section 1, became the mechanism through which the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court ultimately of the United States, adopted or applied the civil liberties in the Bill of Rights to all citizens in every state. That's why we think of the post-Civil War amendments, and particularly the 14th Amendment, as the real beginning of civil liberties across the country for white people. And then starting in really the 20s and 30s, but really accelerating through the 50s and the 60s in litigation, in the civil, and then through the civil rights movement, those civil liberties began to be applied to everyone. Because you have to remember that civil liberties for non-white people, for Black people, for Chinese people, or people of other Asian descent, were denied to them. Certainly for Asian people, they were denied to them by law on the west coast of the United States. And in the southern part of the United States, in the southern states and the states of the Confederacy, civil liberties were denied to Black people, not just by law, but through terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. You could not, if you were a Black person in the states of the Deep South and even the Middle South, attempt to exercise your right, for example, of free speech without the very real possibility of being lynched. And you have the possibility of being lynched by the very law enforcement agencies that were supposed to enforce the law. So really, our civil liberties have been only partially applied, and only applied to the states after the adoption of the 14th Amendment, and only after the incorporation of the liberties guaranteed in the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment over a period of many decades. That is not to say that there were not rights that were guaranteed under state constitutions and were enforced in states, but the uniformity of civil liberties really did not really begin until the mid-20th century. And I'm going to come back to talk about that as part of the crisis that we face. But what is interesting is that civil liberties are liberties that have to be enforced by the government against itself, because they are liberties that are guaranteed against government intrusion. So you can't really have, in any country, civil liberties that are enforceable unless you have an independent judiciary. So we have had a tripartite structure which allows for an independent judiciary. And so we have had the benefit of an independent judiciary which has, over time, in fits and starts, expanded and enforced our civil liberties. Now, take, for example, the right of free speech. The right of free speech was guaranteed in the Soviet Constitution, partially. The Soviet Constitution said there's a right of free speech, but as long as it didn't, disrupt the Communist Party and its rule. But the right of free speech was there. A lot of countries have a right of free speech in their written documents. What they don't have is a way to enforce those rights, because the judiciary is not independent or is corrupt. Luckily, we have had a different structure that has functioned. It has not functioned for everyone, but it functioned. And through the 1960s, and it's the middle part of the 20th century, it was beginning to function on behalf of non-white people. And it has continued to a great extent. That is, racial differences are considered to be a fundamental, that is, racial differences in enforcement of the law and in the guarantees of the civil liberties in the Bill of Rights are considered the most suspect of all things. That is still fundamental in the judiciary. What's happened in the latter part of the 20th century, there's been a number of things which I want to touch on briefly, but the concept of the equal protection of the law, which is fundamental in the 14th Amendment, which is where our civil liberties lie, and due process, which is where that lies, has been applied to women and to LGBTQ people, and recently to transgender people, in really an extraordinary cultural development, which no one anticipated in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, but which came about through the interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The civil liberties that we have are not only those that are expressed in the Bill of Rights. There are additional liberties. Remember, the Bill of Rights has the 9th Amendment, which says this isn't the full enumeration of rights. The right of privacy is not expressed directly in the Bill of Rights. It is found indirectly. But in recent years, especially in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, which was the case which said that you could not have laws against same-sex relationships, the right of privacy was substantially expanded. And you know, people rarely pay attention to Lawrence versus Texas, which was in the late 90s. But it was an extraordinary decision, which really ingrained the right of privacy as a civil liberty. Bear in mind, if we go back to the 1960s, there are two cases, Eisenstadt versus Baird and Griswold versus Connecticut, which were cases about birth control. And at that time, states had the right to tell people, married people, that they could not use birth control.
Appropriate.
And that was found to be an unconstitutional violation of the Equal Protection Clause of due process. And that's really where the primary law on the privacy right arose. Where it continued was in Roe versus Wade, where the privacy right was applied. And now there's been this tremendous reaction over time about that. Now we're in 2020, but that privacy right is still there. Now the court's trying to chip away at that privacy right for women. But so far, it's still there, even with 40 years of effort to get rid of it. So what are our civil liberties? I mean, our civil liberties are the right of free speech, the right to petition government, you know, for redress of grievances, the right to possess firearms, the right to not have soldiers quartered, the right, the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. In the Fifth Amendment, the right to not have property taken except by due process of the law. The Sixth Amendment having to do with federal criminal prosecutions, and the right to jury trial, which was only recently, in terms of unanimous verdict, applied to the states, recently being last year. The Seventh Amendment having to do with right of jury trial in federal trials. civil trials. The 8th Amendment about cruel and unusual punishment. The 9th Amendment saying there's nothing enumerated. The 10th Amendment saying if it ain't written down in this Constitution, it's reserved with the states. But the first 9 amendments are really where our civil liberties lie. One thing that's missing in the Constitution is the right to vote. That is not written in the US Constitution. All the Constitution says, the 15th Amendment says, you can't deny the right to vote to non-white men. The 19th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote on the basis of sex. The 26th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote to anyone, over the age of 18. It used to be 21. 21 was sort of the norm in states. But there's no right to vote in our US Constitution. So what's the crisis? Okay. What's the crisis? The crisis is, in my opinion, the trend in the 21st century towards authoritarianism. That's one crisis. The second crisis is the crisis of income and wealth inequality in the United States and across the world. And the third crisis is the crisis of technological development about communication. And the fourth crisis is the crisis that we're living through now, which is a worldwide pandemic, which is centered in the United States of America, which actually encompasses all 4 crises in one. And the reason that I say that is that in our lifetimes, and I don't know how many of you are baby boomers or how many of you were born post-World War II. World War II was a war about authoritarianism. It was a war about fascism, primarily. And we won. We won. It was a clear victory. But then we went into a period of the Cold War, which was a conflict between allegedly non-authoritarian countries like ours and the surviving European democracies. And we had, what was it then, a 35-year conflict with the Soviet Union. And within that conflict, in the United States, there was clearly an effort to suppress dissent. There was an effort to suppress dissent during the First World War, which, by the way, ended in 1918. It wasn't ended by the flu epidemic. World War II wasn't ended by a flu epidemic. World War I ended because the United States entered the war and helped Britain and France win, and Italy win, and the other powers win, Turkey. That is, but during World War I, there was tremendous repression of opposition to the war. Tremendous repression. After World War II, when we lived through the McCarthyism, there was tremendous repression of dissent about communism. That repression was actually from the federal and state governments. And that is what happened. I could go on and on about this, but then in the next war, there was this explosion of opposition, and there was a tremendous effort at repression. You know, we know about COINTELPRO. We know about the infiltration of the anti-war movement. So the government, which is designed to protect us, that is we are designed to protect against. Our only protection is if the judiciary is there to protect us.
Right.
And if there are mass movements which are there to protect us. And since the end of the civil rights movement, really, and it ended in 1968 with the Housing Act, and things fell apart after that with the Republican Southern strategy, there has been, and then with Reaganism, which followed that, I mean, there's been this huge, huge trend towards income inequality, a huge effort to undo what was done in the Civil Rights Acts, especially the Voting Rights Act. Then we come to the 21st century. We have another war, which we're lied into. There's really an effort at dissent, at muzzling dissent then, but communications have changed. Now, here we are starting in 2016, and where had we ended up? Now I want to talk about communications. Back in the 60s, there were 3 TV stations. Everybody watched one of them, okay? When Walter Cronkite came out and said, I think the war in Vietnam sucks, a lot of people said, the war in Vietnam sucks, because Walter Cronkite said that. Look at where we are now. Now, communication is wholly diffused. Wholly diffused. There is no 1 or 2 places where we go to get information. That has been exploited, as we know, by many entities. And it has also caused the culture to split up. And, you know, there was that, I forgot the name of the book about bowling alone, you know, which was a discussion of all of the prior kinds of things people did together that they no longer do together. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about this talk tonight. It was like, I don't know if you guys remember, you know, when that Alex Haley's book Roots was made into a television special. Okay? 100 million people watched that. It was a cultural experience. Frankly, before that, the Ed Sullivan Show was a cultural experience. Everybody was sharing cultural experiences. Now it's all diffused, it's all segmented. And that has allowed for people, well, it is a mess, but it's allowed for people to only listen to what they want to listen to reinforce their opinions that they already have. And what we face is, in 2016, we elected a carnival barker as president. We elected someone who became known because he was a celebrity, and he was a celebrity because he had a terrible television show that people seemed to enjoy. And he became known because he was a celebrity. And then people voted for him to be president. And little did, well, I shouldn't say little do we know, but many of us suspected, and he's certainly shown incredible authoritarian tendencies. He is an authoritarian. But this is not limited to the United States of America. It's true in China, it's true in India, it's true in Iran, it's true in Israel, it's true in Hungary, it's true in Brazil, that there's been this movement toward authoritarian leaders. And that was happening before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit. And the authoritarian leaders have been, except in China, have been unable to deal with it. That then combined with the killing of George Floyd on why do we even know about George Floyd's murder? Because a kid was standing there with a cell phone,
Right. Yeah.
and videoed it. Otherwise, we would never have known about it. Which then has started an explosion, not only a cultural explosion, but a political explosion. And what was the reaction of the federal government to that? All right, you have these demonstrations in Portland, and you know, if you lived through the anti-war movement, you always knew that there were demonstration after demonstration after demonstration. There were always a small group of people who engaged in violence in the demonstrations. There's always a small group of people who just get so caught up in things that they engaged in violence, you know, breaking windows, so on. And there's always a small subset of criminals who took advantage of that and became looters. It's like, you would think that the government would know about that. It's not the first time it's happened. It always happens that way. And what was the government's response? Our government's response was, our federal government response was to send not even really law enforcement officers to Portland. These were not law enforcement officers. They were customs officers who enforced a single law, that is the immigration laws, and prison guards who don't enforce any law, and among them were contractors for the Department of Health Services, all dressed up in uniforms that made them look like they were really troops. This was unprecedented. This was unprecedented. Why did they go away? Why did they stand down finally in Portland? They stood down because people stood up.
Mhm.
That's the only reason. And that's the second check that we have on authoritarian government. Not just the judiciary, because the judiciary is slow. It's there. It's done some good in this particular instance, but it's slow. Ultimately, in times of crisis, governments will revert to authoritarian behavior, especially when they are, let's just say, they have authoritarian tendencies. That is, the leader has authoritarian tendencies. Anyway, and I'm really trying to be nice in the way I describe this, okay? You know, fascism develops when people allow it to develop. When they allow their civil liberties to be trampled upon. So what we have now is this confluence in America of two things. This cultural and political movement about racial inequality and income inequality. And the income inequality is healthcare inequality too, because they're related. And then we have this opposition to authoritarianism. Those things together are meeting the crisis. Those are the things that have to happen. People have, the only real protection for civil liberties is if people stand up for them. If they let other people do it, or they say, well, the political system or the judicial system will take care of it, people who think that way are making a very big mistake. And in America, because we had an authoritarian president and his authoritarian friends in power in the Senate, we have a federal judiciary who we cannot, in the near term, count on to defend our civil liberties. The way that they have to be defended is people have to be prepared to take action when they're being infringed. That's a hard thing to do. when I was an undergraduate here and I studied with Harvey Goldberg, who was a very eminent professor, a history professor, he talked about two things. One was the shock of recognitions when you finally wake up and realize what's going on in a social movement. And the other is the embarrassment of physical confrontation. And luckily in Portland, we saw people who weren't embarrassed, who stood up to an extraordinary expression of authoritarianism. The crisis for our civil liberties is, will there be enough people who will stand up? That's number one. And number two, will our right to vote, which is not guaranteed as a civil liberty, be infringed in the next, 82 days? That's a crisis. Because frankly, if authoritarianism from the federal government continues, we can kiss our civil liberties goodbye. You know, I'm confident that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is going to hold on till January 21st.
She better.
But if January 20th sees Donald Trump reelected, we can kiss the independent federal judiciary goodbye for a long, long time. And we're going to have to protect ourselves. So that's just my opinion, you know, with a little bit of background. And I'm happy to talk to you all about it. I mean, I could go on and on about this, and this could actually be an entire semester's discussion with actual things that would, I think, verify some of the things that I've said. But, you know, I just want to put that out there and be happy to have a nice discussion for the next half an hour.
Well, Esther, that's some opinion, and we'd love to listen to it for a whole semester. I'm sure we can guarantee that. But it would be great to get a conversation going right now. So if you'd like to raise your hand on Zoom or just in person, we can see most of you that are have your video on.
Art's first, I think.
Oh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, so what happens or what should happen if Trump refuses to accept that he's lost the election in November?
Okay, well, two things. First of all, I assume the results of the congressional elections will all be counted. If they're all counted and they're certified, and there's a Democratic majority in the House, on January 20th, if there's no certification of Donald Trump as president, if the Electoral College is still up in the air, Nancy Pelosi becomes president on January 20th. That's assuming that the congressional elections are verified. If there is really a actual momentum by Donald Trump to try to keep power when he has not been, when he's lost the election, or appears to have lost the election. This isn't the first time I've said this. We all have to go to Washington, however we can get there. I mean, this will be the biggest crisis in the history of America, the United States of America. Mm-hmm. And the only way that the crisis will be solved, if it's tied up in court and if Trump is saying, I'm still the president and so forth, is to occupy Washington, D.C., is to occupy the Capitol, and frankly, to occupy the White House. Could that happen? Yeah, it could. If a couple million people go to Washington, D.C. will stop functioning. And that's what has to happen. Because that would be like what happened in Italy with Mussolini. It would be like what happened in Germany with Hitler. I mean, Hitler was elected, you know, and then dissolved the parliament and seized power. Well, people let him do that by well, it's easy in hindsight to see. probably know or really care that much because they underestimated who this guy was and what he had the potential to do. But if we have a president who says, I'm not leaving office after an election, we don't have any choice. And it'll be chaos. It'll be chaos all over the country. Now, the problem with chaos can be put down. But I have actually a strange thing for someone who came of age in the 60s. I actually have a certain amount of faith in the military. And I just don't think that they would put up with it. I mean, at a certain point, it's going to come down to, will they go into the streets to fight their own citizens? And I think the answer is no. But God only knows what's going to happen with this crazy guy. I mean, man, woman, person, camera, TV. I'm a stable genius. It's frightening. I mean, it's really frightening.
But we're in the middle of a pandemic, and for people to march on Washington might be very difficult in January or in December or whenever it is. So that really causes a big problem. And he doesn't care about pandemics. I mean, he goes out and rallies around his crowds. So it's quite different.
Well, that's true. But if it would be, it would be absolute chaos. Absolute chaos. Not to make you.
Hildy was next.
Lester's still answering, and then Hildy can come
Oh,
in.
okay. Go on. I'm sorry.
I'll give you one other thing to worry about. 27 states have called for a constitutional convention. It means only 6 more have to, I think it's only 6 more have to vote for it before there's a constitutional convention. If that would happen, and I gave a talk at the law school on the 150th anniversary of law school in 2017 or 18. No one knows what would happen at a constitutional convention. No one. Because there's only been one. And that was a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. And out of that came the U.S. Constitution. So that's just one other thing to worry about. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could.
So I don't know if you can answer this, but what would happen if he skewed the election with the mail problem and all those things and won, but everybody knows that he didn't really win? What would happen if that happened, do you think?
I think he'd be president for 4 years. That's what, I mean, if there'll be a whole bunch of absentee ballots that don't get delivered,
Yeah.
I mean, that'd be like Florida 2000, Florida 2000, except to be in practically every state. I don't see any way that would be resolved other than the Supreme Court stepping in and doing what it did in 2000. But there'd be chaos, but he'd be the president.
We have
Felice.
Eve and then Felice.
Oh, okay.
And then Joan. Eve, unmute yourself, please.
Oh.
Eve. Was it Julie? I'm sorry.
No.
All right. Felice, why don't you go ahead?
How do we make sure that doesn't happen? How do we get those ballots delivered?
Well, if I could do anything, there are 2 things I would do. One, I would encourage as many people as possible to vote in person.
Yeah.
Despite the epidemic, despite the pandemic. I mean, we saw in Milwaukee, there wasn't much of a spike in Milwaukee after people voted in person. And there are more protections now than there would be than there were back in April. I'm actually going to vote in person. I don't want to vote. I'd like to help to bring down the number of absentee ballots. And so for me to go over to First Congregational Church at 7 o'clock in the morning, nobody's there anyway. I think that's one thing. The other thing that I would like to see would be some public effort to get UPS and FedEx to say, we'll deliver the absentee ballots for free. You know, for FedEx, for UPS, hey, we're a big corporation, you know, there's a problem with the postal service, there should be free elections. Talk about a great public relations deal, you know?
Yeah.
The problem is, you know, I don't know if the CEOs of those companies are our friends.
Right.
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, you know, Bill Gates could say to the Postal Service, you know, or Mark Zuckerberg could say, yeah, you know, you need $1 billion, you need a couple $1 billion here.
Yeah.
I don't hear him doing that. So, but I would love to see you know, FedEx and UPS step up and say, hey, we'll help you out. I mean, boy, you know, talk about great PR.
Joan?
It may sound naive, but I think one of the stumbling blocks in front of the president when he doesn't want to leave is the military does not like him. The generals are no longer in his corner, and they might actually stop him.
Yeah, they don't like him. Yeah. But who knows?
I mean, I know it's an unknown. The Pentagon is a big place, and he doesn't go near the Pentagon.
That's true. You know, military leaders are actually pretty well educated. So it must be terrible to have to deal with a president who isn't.
According to their books.
Yeah.
Steve?
I was wondering about, Lester, you know, thinking about the history of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. goes from trying to enforce legal equality to trying to deal with the inequality issue in terms of the economics and all the rest of that. And we know that those two things are very much entangled. I mean, if you have no money and no power in the society, then you have no civil rights. And, you know, you can see that in many different dimensions of our social scene. So how do we make the income equality be as serious an issue as some of the other issues having to do with civil rights?
That's actually a very good question. I'll tell you my answer to that. If the Democrats take control of the Senate, and there's a Democratic president, the first thing that they have to do is amend and expand the Voting Rights Act. And if the minority says they're going to filibuster that, then they have to eliminate the filibuster. Because the Voting Rights Act was limited by the Roberts Court, which eliminated Section 5, which required pre-clearance of any changes to voting mechanisms and by any state. And Justice Roberts, I think it was Justice Roberts who asked the then Solicitor General, you know, are you saying, because the pre-clearance only applied to the states of the Confederacy. And he said, are you saying that people in the southern states are more racist than people anywhere else? And the Solicitor General said, no. And I've always been very critical of that answer, although having since then argued numerous cases in the Wisconsin Supreme Court where the people asking the questions sometimes were, let's just say, less than the most stellar judges. I'm saying it that way because I like to keep my license. The answer to him should have been, no, people in the southern states are not more racist, but the political culture that existed there from the post-Civil War Reconstruction time through the passage of the Civil Rights Act and through the renewal of the Voting Rights Act has not significantly changed. And that's why they continue to need pre-clearance. But what has to happen now is we need pre-clearance everywhere, because we've seen states all over the country, including Wisconsin, which has taken steps to make it more difficult for people to vote. So that's got to be the bottom line thing. Once people have the right to vote, and once you then, and really, actually, it's an interesting question you asked, because yesterday Kamala Harris was named as the vice presidential candidate with Joe Biden. That is fascinating. It's fascinating for a very interesting reason, I think, which is previously the Democratic Party wouldn't do that because they're afraid of alienating white voters. They wouldn't put a Kamala Harris on the ticket in this circumstance. When we did elect an African-American president, the backlash to that was the Democratic Party lost the white voters in the Midwest. And Donald Trump was elected president subsequently. Now, apparently, the Democratic Party doesn't care because they realize you got to take care of the people who are taking care of you. The people who are taking care of the Democratic Party are now African-American voters, to a certain extent Latino voters. Jewish voters have always been there and haven't left. Asian voters are moving more and more in that direction. So the time is actually ripe for, if there's a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, to really make a lot of moves to deal with income inequality. First move has got to be voting rights. The second move has got to be expanding the Affordable Care Act so that people have health insurance that's portable. Because now, gobs of people who had health insurance have lost it, and gobs of people now realize that without portable health insurance, they're totally screwed. So there's an opening here, given how stuff works in Washington. Assuming Joe Biden's elected president, will he and his advisors and people in the Senate, if they have a majority, know how to take advantage of it? I don't know.
Please talk about the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the governor's stay-at-home order and all that mess.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm gonna really have to control myself about this. That was probably the worst decision that has ever been made by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, for a very, very simple reason. To reach the decision, the most conservative justices on the court backed away from what they considered to be the primary way that statutes are to be interpreted. So you had Rebecca Bradley, Dan Kelly, Annette Ziegler, and Pat Roggensack all adopting this belief in what's called textualism. Textualism is a means of statutory interpretation which says we don't look at anything except the words of the statute. And if you can understand the meaning of the words of the statute, that's what the statute means. It doesn't matter the context in which it was adopted. It doesn't matter what the legislative history is. It doesn't matter what anybody said about it at the time. The words have meaning. You have to enforce the words and what they mean. The statute that gave the power to the Department of Health Services to issue emergency orders used to say that the department had to adopt those emergency orders by an administrative rule. So the word rule is there. In 1981, the word order was added. So then it said rule or order. Rule and order cannot in any way mean the same thing if they're used in three separate sentences in the same statute. When it says rule or order, rule or order, rule or order. That majority said rule and order mean the exact same thing. The only way that they could come to that was through this bizarre mental gymnastics of a decision in which they got to the result that they wanted. And it truly is the worst decision ever made by that court because it was so blatantly ideological. And the ideology had nothing to do with the law. The ideology had to do with serving their masters in the legislature. And that decision showed that that majority, those 4 justices, were nothing more than a subcommittee of the legislature. They do what the legislature wants. There's another part to it too, which is they allowed the legislature to bring a lawsuit in its own name. And there's no basis for the legislature to do that without an act of the legislature, except that the Joint Committee on Legislative Organization said, okay, go hire a lawyer at $800 an hour and bring this lawsuit. So it's really, I mean, you know, if you want me to go on, I can't go on and on anymore about it, but that's why it was so terrible. The amazing thing was that none of us expected Brian Hagedorn to do what he did. Brian Hagedorn wrote a dissenting opinion, which was absolutely, unbelievably correct. And we were shocked. And that's good because Jill Karofsky and Brian Hagedorn work together in the Department of Justice. They're kind of friends. Things might change.
Miller.
And I can still keep my law license.
There you go. You're unmuted.
Lester, I want to politely dissent from your comment that everybody should actually vote on November 3rd, because the risk is that if there is COVID in the Madison area and or the weather's bad and you don't want to stand in any line or you're not feeling well yourself, better I would offer to get your request an absentee ballot, get it early and mail it in as soon as you get it in the mail so the post office or UPS, whoever, has the maximum amount of time to get it back. Or if it slips on election day, take that absentee ballot to the polls. You won't have to be at the polls quite as long. You may not have to stand in a line if you drop it off at the polling place. But I'm concerned, Lester, that you're asking people to take a health risk that can be perhaps avoided.
Okay.
I say that with all due respect.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I have to amend what I said. Okay. If you're going to use an absentee ballot, get it early and drop it off at one of the early drop-off sites.
Right.
You know.
Thank you.
Yeah, but that's available in Madison. It's readily available in Madison, you know, the libraries and so forth. It's not. I don't think it's that readily available everywhere else. But,
okay.
Yeah, but you're right.
Can I dissent on a second thing?
Sure.
On a slightly different topic. And that was, okay, Trump decides he's not going to walk away from the White House. A couple of things can happen, though. One, the military can take away the nuclear code box or give it to Joe Biden and disassemble that box so that if Trump plays with it, it's inoperable. Number two, the military can take away Air Force One. They can take away the helicopter. So it looks like he's pretty ineffective and kind of sort of present the powers to Joe Biden or to Nancy Pelosi. So there's slightly less risk that it will all end up having to go to Washington, at least I hope.
I haven't gone to Washington.
My point.
I haven't gone to Washington for a demonstration since 1960. No, since 1969, 1983, with a march on Washington for Soviet Jewry. Mm-hmm. 69 was the big one.
I was also there in 69, and I was a couch, and we were born the same year.
Okay.
Yes, I was there. But anyway, it might not come to all of us old people getting in buses and ending up at the mall.
Gil, you want to?
Lester, I wanted to go back to the list you gave of global crises around the world today. That was a fascinating list. One additional one might be climate change as a long-term global crisis. And I wondered if you could speak about environmental law and dissent in environmental law that we're seeing. I mean, it's been for many years, but whether how you think that will evolve in the coming times.
All right, Gil, I have to say that that's really outside of my area of expertise. But you should invite my partner, Krista Westerberg, to come and talk about that, because she does environmental law and she's brilliant.
Okay. Deal.
And, have her come and talk about it. She really knows it. I don't.
Okay.
I really don't.
Okay. Okay. It's a deal.
Mary.
Maybe this is just fantasy or something I want to believe, but I've worked with a lot of bipartisan legislation in my history, but it seems like we're hearing more Republican leadership not so happy with Trump. So if he would come up with some false reason or not leave office, do you think there also could be a group of Republicans that would be against that?
I once said in a hearing when an administrative law judge said to me, I was putting in some medical records. The administrative law judge said, "Well, you know, those medical records can just be completely wrong. It's possible they could be completely wrong." And I said, "Yes, it's also possible that a meteor will fall through the roof of this building."
Yeah.
I guess that's a no.
I actually think that, and this, I actually believe that the Republican, primarily in the House of Representatives, but also in the Senate, are actually part of a cult. And I don't believe that that people will act outside of the precepts of the cult. So I'm very pessimistic about them doing anything because they benefit from the cult. So, but I
hope you're wrong.
I really hope I'm wrong, but I don't see any evidence that they'll do anything.
Steve?
You know, one of the things that's really intrigued me and bothered me a lot in the last number of years is the way that the right frames issues as matters of civil liberties.
Right.
They constantly take, an issue like wearing masks and say, what is the government doing enforcing this upon me? Why do I have to pay my taxes? Why do I have to, act in a civilized manner? I don't have to. I can.
Why do I have to pay my grazing fees?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's like, it's like I once sent to an anti-vaxxer. I said, do you have any friends who have died of polio or smallpox? And if not, why not? I never got a response. Putting a mask on, it's like, okay, you can get a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt.
Yeah.
Why do I get pulled over when I'm doing 85 and then 70? Who says I can't drive 150 miles an hour on a highway?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, the discussion. People. It's not a matter of constitutional law. It's not. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the government can't direct you to take certain measures to protect the public health. They can't. What if it was a war? What if in California, and this is what drove me crazy with the discussion, which I was not involved in, I wasn't arguing the case, where Rebecca Bradley started talking about the Japanese internment in the Karamatsu case. She didn't talk about, well, the problem with that was it was directed just at people because of their ancestry and race. But if the government had said to people in San Francisco, you have to evacuate San Francisco because there's an imminent potential invasion from Japan, where people said, well, you can't tell me to do that. You can't tell me. What are you talking about? I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here. In that circumstance, they would be making the same argument. You can't tell me what to do. Well, we all elect these people to tell us what to do in emergencies. And they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
So here we are. So always wear your mask. Except on
It's interesting because by framing these issues in terms of civil liberties, they convince a lot of people that I think. I mean, there's a lack of discussion about responsibility in terms of citizens towards their fellow citizens, and towards being participants in a government. I mean,
I agree. I don't think America. I mean, I was born after World War II. I don't think, and this has been my entire life since 1950. I can't think of one time when Americans have been asked to sacrifice.
Yeah.
Since I was born. We have wars. People aren't asked to be taxed. They aren't taxed. There isn't a draft that is applied equally. I mean, people have not been asked to sacrifice, except the most powerless people are asked to sacrifice. But overall, no. So it's a bad situation. But on the other hand, what are we going to do? People don't want to wear masks. They want to wear masks. Eventually, it's just like people didn't want to wear seatbelts either. Eventually, you're onto it. So. And a final thought, for lawyers who do personal injury cases, such as my law firm, because of the pandemic, there are fewer accidents.
Yeah.
So
I think they should leave all the romaine lettuce with the E. coli just in the produce section.
I'll pass.
After all, people are entitled to buy romaine lettuce.
I'll pass.
Never mind if it kills you.
But it kills them, not you.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say one thing. I'm sitting here. It's interesting, and I think you're not the only one, Lester, who all of us who are upset about what's going on are thinking a little bit about relying on the military. We've thought that some of the generals, as the president called his generals early on, who he then fired, would kind of control him. And so I think it's a bit different. We're all, I think, in a sense, counting on the military. But I can't think of having a little experience with high-level officers, at least from the Pentagon when I was in Washington for 5 years. They are, I think somebody said they're very high-level folks, and they are. There is so much drilled into them from day one about being under civilian control. I can't think of I think they'd rather go to war, which they are the last ones who want to do because they're the ones that get hurt. I think they'd rather go to war than have to make a decision about what should happen in the civil government in the United States. I think they would be extremely reticent about doing anything like that. Not that they won't, but I think that's their biggest nightmare.
Yeah, I bet that's right. Well, I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Thank you very
Lester.
much. Thank everyone.
I have to get back to session 2 of Camp Grammy and Grandpa.
Called Reading a Good Night Story.
That's right.
This was wonderful. So this will be taped and recorded and combined with the first 2. So we'll have a whole packet.
Thank you for inviting me. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lester.
This
Thank
was
you
really
all.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be in touch. So if you have suggestions for new series, we can get Lester back too for step 2. So that would be great.
Very cool.
After high holidays, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lester.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Thanks.
And thank you, Linda.
Sure, you bet.
So we have this on recording. I stepped out for a moment because we lost internet in the house, and I'm on my phone right now.
Oh.
This happens. So
wow. Yeah, I've been recording it, and I can just get an email off to Stephanie tomorrow, just making sure that they have it on their system.
Okay, great. Okay. And then we can start thinking about how to do the next ones. Bye, Hildy.
Bye, Hildy.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to talk to you, Hildy. Maybe tomorrow let's talk about Hebrew. Yeah.
Bill, this was just great.
Lester's amazing.
Really,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I want to tell you, Linda was amazing too, and so was Joel. So this was
Linda
really
was a conflict with another Zoom at Bethel.
Today, yeah, I know. I didn't know anything about that. That was a surprise.
I know. It was a committee that was working on Senior Shabbat, and I happened to be on that. So I was on another Zoom the whole time Linda talked.
Linda. And then today, apparently, there was another conflict. I thought they weren't going to allow that to happen.
Yeah. There was some other conflict.
Rabbi
so much going on that it's impossible not to.
All right, I'll talk to Nicole I'll ask Nicole if there's a way to normalize all this so that it doesn't happen.
Anyway, this was just really, it was just.
Yeah, Lester's amazing.
Thank you so much for
Isn't he? Yeah.
I mean, we've had 3 fantastic talks, Linda and Joel and Lester.
He's really something.
Doesn't get any better.
Yeah. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Stay
Bye.
safe, everybody.
Thanks, Linda. Bye-bye.
You bet.
Bye.